Yeah, the first thing that I wanted to talk about today was I had a plan. Like I had everything that I wanted to do, and I was blindsided by a tweet that I saw earlier today, which kind of reminded me of kind of a conversation that's been going around and around and around and around in the 5th edition D&D circle for a long time now. Someone that I follow called Ahmed. It's 20 Arabia RPG on Twitter. So they said, can anyone tell me the pros and cons of using potions as a bonus action in 5th edition D&D? I'm not convinced to use this homebrew rule. And I was like, man, that, it's a kind of contentious topic, and whenever I see it being discussed on Twitter, people get really passionate about the topic of potions in D&D. The thing that we have to talk about when we talk about potions, so if we just go with the straightforward standard potion of healing, it's an action to use because it's an item, so you have to use an item action in order to use a healing potion, and it heals 2d4 plus 2 hit points. So it's just a glug, heal, done. And so it is in essence the same as the Cure Wounds spell in a roundabout way. I think that the average is slightly different, but it more or less does the same thing. Like a cleric is probably going to heal more just by the nature of having a higher wisdom modifier. But for all intents and purposes, it's a Cure Wounds. For all intents and purposes, it's a scroll of Cure Wounds. So we have to think about why that's the case. We have to think about why is it an action, and why is Cure Wounds an action to cast as well. And I think the reason for that, and maybe part of the reason why I think people want potions to be a bonus action so much, is because it feels really bad to get to your turn in combat. In some cases where you've got like 5-6 players, it takes ages to get around to your turn. You've been injured. The last thing that you want to do is spend your entire turn, or at least the main part of your entire turn, unless you've got other fancy things you can do as a bonus action, guzzling a potion. And it's like bad use of action economy, right? Because you're gonna drink a potion to not take damage, or cast Cure Wounds or whatever to not take that damage, and then whatever's attacking you is just going to attack you again, and you're back down to 0. So the net result is that it's just making the fight take longer. My opinion on it is that, to me, potions are not designed for use in combat, or not. Like the intention of a potion and the intention of a spell like Cure Wounds is that it's not intended for use in combat. The idea is you use them out of combat to top up your hit points before going into a potential combat scenario, or simply to reduce the need to take short rests. And this, when I was thinking about this while I was constructing my response, I didn't want to just say no. I wanted to explain the reasons why, kind of in keeping with their question of, well, what are the pros and cons. But a few people had already kind of gone into that, and one of the pros is that you can drink your potion and still do something, which is great. But that brings with it a kind of weird imbalance, because by making potions bonus actions, you are not invalidating, but there's a lot of redundancy in that, because like thieves, for example, the rogue subclass thieves get fast hands, which is an ability that lets them use items as a bonus action, which immediately makes potions more valuable to them because they can do that. And another thing is like clerics, bards, and kind of several subclasses get access to Healing Word, which is, that to me, that is a healing spell that has been optimized for use in combat. That's what its purpose is. You don't use Healing Word outside of combat. You use it so you can heal someone and also do something else. And there's things like fighters get second wind, which is basically that. Like, as a bonus action, they can regain some hit points. So you're kind of it's a weird thing. I guess it depends on the classes in your game, but by having that bonus action in place, you are kind of trimming down on what makes those classes that little, like, they're fringe things, and maybe it's a bit nitpicky, but in my opinion, it's like the thief, for example. You get fast hands and second story work. You don't get another thief specific action or thief specific feature until like 9th level. What the conclusion that I came to, though, in thinking about this, is I reached a middle ground. And see, some of you are saying in chat that it depends on party comp. I don't think it does anymore. I considered that, and that's part of the reason why we use that rule in our Ravnica game, because there are no dedicated healers in the Ravnica game. It's 3 wizards, a sorcerer, and a fighter, none of which have healing capabilities. However, the more that I thought about it in kind of responding to this tweet, the more I realized that it's less to do with the party's composition, and I think more to do with the way that the DM handles combat, or at least potential combat, in their games. And I think we're seeing a trend at the moment where, at its inception, you can tell, like, reading the Dungeon Master's Guide and talking about like balancing encounters and things like that, and talking about the standard adventuring day. The intent of 5th edition at the start was that the average adventuring day was going to contain like 5 to 7 encounters. So to me, it seems like the design intent originally was that you would have several smaller encounters in one adventuring day, and the reasoning behind that is to kind of tax the player's resources and kind of force them to make, not force them, but kind of put them in situations where maybe the 4 fights that they've been in haven't been particularly tough, but by the time that they reach the 5th one, it's not any more difficult than the others. But by the nature of the fact that they've used a lot of resources to get to this point, that fight just becomes naturally more difficult because they've got less to fall back on. Now, I say this because in that scenario, where you've got 4 or 5 potential combat encounters with gaps in between each one, things like Cure Wounds and things like Potions of Healing, the fact that they take an action to use doesn't matter as much, because things like Short Rests as well, like they're not as important. It's the fact that they take an action to use don't matter as much, because there's more breaks in between combat encounters for you to stop and be like, right, do I need to take a potion? Do I need to cast a spell to top myself up before going into this next thing? You know, take stock of what we're doing. Do we need to take a rest? Blah, blah, blah. The trend now that I'm seeing, and that I'm kind of taking part in myself, to be honest, is that's not so much a thing. We're seeing maybe 1 to 2 combat encounters per adventuring session, adventuring day, whatever. So because there's less combat, and as a result of there being less combat, that combat is likely more challenging and forces the players to use more of their resources in combat itself just to stay afloat. I think the value of being able to use a potion in combat rather than out of combat massively increases. Where it counts is how the DM handles combat. If it's less difficult combat encounters, then I think potions are fine, and I think, you know, action healing spells like Cure Wounds are fine. Whereas if your DM more skews towards like really hard encounters less often, then the ability to heal in combat naturally becomes a lot more powerful, because you also because short rests become less effective. And I think this trend also bleeds through into people think that hit dice are a bit of a redundant thing, especially as you get into later levels, because you'll have maybe 1 short rest because the DMs are throwing less combat encounters at you. During that short rest, you'll maybe spend half of your hit die, but you'll never spend more than half. So we're seeing more and more people be like, well, here's this resource that no one ever uses. Let's use it for homebrew stuff and use it as like an additional thing to to tap into. I'm not gonna turn around and say that this means that DMs aren't doing it properly. Like they're not running their games properly or anything like that. Because I don't. I tend to do one or two combats per session. Just by the nature of combat is a very Marmite thing among my players. Some of my players love it, some of my players hate it. So I do try and keep it to a minimum, and when it does show up, it's impactful. That's my goal. So as you kind of approach that side of things, I think the value of having access to faster healing is important. It's an interesting conversation. I think it's a conversation that people get a little bit too up in arms about. But I think that's just because, like, DMs especially, I think it's very easy for us to get very precious about the way that we run our games. And when someone comes along asserting that the way we're doing things is maybe wrong, we can get a bit upset. But that's just, it's natural. Just maybe chill out. Like, as long as you and your players are having fun, who cares? That's just my thoughts on it. Like, I personally prefer them being something that you use out of combat, and that's why I will always err towards them being an action rather than a bonus action. But I can see the argument, and I think that's where the argument comes from. It was just my observation.